Hi guys, welcome to my channel More Than a Mom. You can call me E. This segment is called Women in History, where I highlight a woman who has made a difference in society, their community, or has accomplished something that was very challenging. We stan an educated queen around here. So, let's get educated. Today's woman is Phillis Wheatley, the first African-American author of a published book of poetry in the US. And by American, I mean she is African but transported to the United States due to slavery. So, let's take a look at her extraordinary life. Phillis Wheatley was born around 1753 in Gambia, Africa. She was captured by slavers when she was about 7 or 8 years old and transported to Boston in 1761. This is where slaves that were unsuited for the rigorous labor in the West Indian and Southern colonies due to either age or physical frailty were sold. Her first name, Phillis, was derived from the ship that brought her to America, the Phyllis. In the month of August 1761, in want of a domestic, Susanna Wheatley, wife of prominent Boston tailor John Wheatley, purchased a slender, frail female child for a trifle. Because the captain of the slave ship believed that the waif, Phyllis, was terminally ill, and he still wanted to gain at least a small profit before she died, he sold her for barely anything. Although Wheatley was very frail, this did not excuse her from all domestic duties in the Wheatley household. But in addition to these, the Wheatley family made the interesting decision to educate their young charge by teaching her to read and write. Within 16 months of her arrival in America, she could read the Bible, the Greek and Latin classics of Virgil, Ovid, Terence, and Homer, and British literature, particularly John Milton and Alexander Pope. She also studied astronomy and geography. These accomplishments would be amazing for any child of any race in any day and age, but especially for a girl in her circumstances. In To the University of Cambridge in New England, probably the first poem she wrote but didn't publish until 1773, Wheatley indicated that despite this exposure, rich and unusual for an American slave, her spirit yearned for the intellectual challenge of a more academic atmosphere. She was clearly very gifted, and the title of slave could not take that from her. Of course, it wasn't possible for her to attend college, again because she was a slave, but she began writing her own poems in her teenage years. Eventually, Phillis Wheatley became well known around Boston for her poetry. Newspapers and pamphlets published her writings as early as 1767. Frequently, she wrote her poems in the style of odes and tributes. Publications of an elegiac poem on the death of the celebrated divine George Whitefield, I don't know who that is, you're gonna have to look him up, in 1770 brought her great notoriety at 13 or 14 years old. Published as a broadside in a pamphlet in Boston, Newport, and Philadelphia, the poem was published with Ebenezer Pemberton's funeral sermon for Whitefield in London in 1771, bringing her international acclaim. By the time she was 18, Wheatley had gathered a collection of 28 poems for which she, with the help of Mrs. Wheatley, ran advertisements for in Boston newspapers in February 1772. However, when the colonists were apparently unwilling to support literature by an African, she and the Wheatleys turned in frustration to London for a publisher. in 1773 with financial support from the English Countess of Huntingdon, a wealthy supporter of evangelical and abolitionist causes. Wheatley, now suffering from a chronic asthma condition and accompanied by the Wheatley's son Nathaniel, left for London on May 8, 1771, to publish her first collection of poems. The now celebrated poetess was welcomed by several dignitaries: abolitionist patron the Earl of Dartmouth, poet and activist Baron George Lyttelton, Sir Brooke Watson, soon to be the Lord Mayor of London, philanthropist John Thornton, and Benjamin Franklin. Poems on various subjects, religious and moral, was the first book written by an enslaved Black woman in America. It included a foreword signed by John Hancock and other Boston notables, as well as a portrait of Wheatley, all designed to prove that the work was indeed written by a Black woman. Wheatley's poems reflected several influences on her life, among them the well-known poets she studied such as Alexander Pope and Thomas Gray. But what was also evident was pride in her African heritage. Her writing style embraced the elegy, likely from her African roots, where it was the role of girls to sing and perform funeral dirges. Religion was also a key influence, and it led Protestants in America and England to enjoy her work. Enslavers and abolitionists both read her work, the former to convince the enslaved population to convert, for shame, the latter as proof of the intellectual abilities of people of color. Her love of virgin and perhaps untouched America, as well as her religious fervor, is further suggested by the names of those colonial leaders who signed the attestation that appeared in some copies of poems on various subjects to authenticate and support her work. Those were Thomas Hutchinson, Governor of Massachusetts, John Hancock, Andrew Oliver, Lieutenant Governor, James Audouin, and Reverend Mather Byles. Another fervent Wheatley supporter was Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Although Wheatley supported the American Revolution, she believed that slavery was the issue that prevented the colonists from achieving true heroism. She wrote several letters to ministers and others on liberty and freedom. During the peak of her writing career, she wrote a well-received poem praising the appointment of George Washington as the commander of the Continental Army. While Wheatley was recrossing the Atlantic to reach Mrs. Wheatley, who at the summer's inn had become seriously ill, Bell was circulating the first edition of Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, the first volume of poetry by an African American published in modern times. Wheatley was emancipated some 3 months before Mrs. Wheatley died on March 3, 1774. Although many British editorials castigated the Wheatleys for keeping Wheatley and slavery while presenting her to London as the African genius, the family had provided an ambiguous haven for the poet. Wheatley was kept in a servant's place, a respectable arm's length from the Wheatleys' genteel circles, but she had experienced neither slavery's treacherous demands nor the harsh economic exclusions pervasive in a free Black existence. With the death of her benefactor, Wheatley slipped toward this tenuous life of no financial security. Mary Wheatley and her father died in 1778. Nathaniel, who had married and moved to England, died in 1783. Throughout the lean years of the war and the following depression, the assault of these racial realities was more than her sickly body or aesthetic soul could withstand. In 1778, Wheatley married John Peters, a free black man from Boston with whom she had 3 children, although unfortunately none of them survived. Efforts to publish a second book of poems failed. To support her family, she worked as a maid in a boarding house while continuing to write poetry. She never again achieved the success of her younger years. Wheatley became ill and died on December 5, 1784. Wheatley's poems continue to be studied by scholars to this day, and many institutions have honored her legacy. Her story is truly remarkable and has so many gray areas in terms of her upbringing and exposure to the world. Regardless, I hope her poetic soul was able to finally fly free in the end, because she was truly an amazing woman in history.